I've gone through your Twitter over the last week or so and just pulled some interesting conversations you've had. You said, do you see a problem with slavery and beating them in a form of discipline? And then someone said, no, I don't see a problem. What's your objection? And then you said, easy mute.
Easy mute.
Slavery in the Old Testament was for the benefit of both the slave owner and the slave. So-called slaves had a lot of rights and are better described as some Hebrew word workers. Slavery is wrong. Atheist also. Abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, fornication, etc. are right. Yeah, they made it.
The progression in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though, is toward civilization, right? That's everything moves toward the city, and it's all positive movement toward the city. It's like, this is what we should be striving for. Well, if you understand that, and then go read Genesis 1 through 11, it's a polemic. It's a direct polemic against Mesopotamian concepts of ideal civilization. And what scares me so much about slavery apologetics is when you're making those arguments about Exodus 21, you're making the same fucking arguments about that people made about in the Antebellum South. It's the same argument.
Welcome everyone to the Deep Drinks podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Josh, who graduated from Johns Hopkins University in 2017 with a PhD in Assyriology. It's our first doctor on the Deep Drinks podcast. Josh runs the Digital Hummarabi YouTube channel and podcast alongside his amazing wife, Megan Lewis, as well as co-hosts the HeBANE podcast, which stands for, is that right? HeBANE? HeBANE podcast, which stands for Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East. Dr. Josh has authored multiple books, with two of his most popular being Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Which, spoiler alert, yes, it seems. So, and the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1, and Volume 2 is coming out shortly. Dr. Josh has also appeared on many popular YouTube channels such as The Atheist Experience with Matt Dillahunty, the Myth Vision podcast, the Non Sequitur Show, Apologia, The Thinking Atheist, and Modern Day Debate, among many others. I hope I didn't miss any major ones. So welcome, Josh, Dr. Josh.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate you having me. That was very, very gracious intro.
Well, last night I was writing it and I'm like, man, like it just keeps going. Like you're doing so much at the moment. Is it your full-time job at this stage or?
No, definitely not. And actually Megan runs Digital Hummarabi. And she does, I've become kind of a contributor to it now. But she has really taken off. I think she's almost up to 35,000 subscribers now. So she's doing a wonderful job. But I feel like I end up on more places outside of our channel than I do on our channel anymore. Because I doing interviews and things, which is great. Which is great. Yeah, well, I think that's why I'm here.
Popularity has seemed to spike recently.
Well, I mean, I think it's maybe just because I know people that are a lot smarter than me. That's all it is. They're like, if we can get Josh, then maybe we can get this other better person.
Nah, I don't think that's the case. So you're in America, obviously. Mm-hmm. You're America? Yeah, definitely America, because the drink of choice that you chose is bourbon. So Woodford Reserve. So I went out and got a bottle. If anyone doesn't know, the Deep Drinks podcast is where we sip the guest's drink of choice and we discuss deep topics. So Josh reckons we drink this neat, so we drink this neat. This is what we do.
You don't have to. I'm not creative. That's all it is.
No, well, you know what? Like some of the drinks that some of the guests have asked for, I've had to go out. I've never even like I think the last guest we drank cucumber and mint, like a very specific cucumber and mint vodka, and I was like, I've never tasted it in my life. I love whiskeys, so this is.
I'll tell you a very short, funny story about my great inexperience drinking alcohol. We were talking about this just a little bit before we started recording, but when I was in Germany, I did a Fulbright year in 2014 to 2015, and I had a friend out there who was, I guess I was 30, 35, 36 at the time. Does that sound right? and he was 20, and we lifted weights together. That was our commonality. That was our connection. And we went out one Friday night, and I hadn't eaten, and you walk everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I was like lifting weights like 4 hours a day or something dumb, and I hadn't eaten dinner yet, and it was probably 8 o'clock at night. And he said, "Man, there's this. We'll go get a yufka, Turkish, like a Turkish. It's like a euro." But he said, "We'll go get one of those, but let's get a drink first." I know this great bar, so we went down. It was like this cellar, and sat down there. And he said, "Have you ever had a deep sea diver?" And I said, "I don't even know what that is." So it's like they bring out this, looks like a beer glass full of what turns out to be like 4 different types of rum, with a little bit of lime or something in it. And they give you a straw. I mean, what? So, of course, I have no experience. I have a totally empty stomach. I'm probably a little dehydrated. And I drank this whole thing through in about 3 minutes.
Oh.
And it turned out to be another, like the next hour and a half was not great. but those are the types of experiences that I have with alcohol. So you will see me sipping this very, very slowly.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I have this, like, it's 10 a.m. where I am in Australia. Luckily, day drinking isn't frowned upon in Australia. So I will just continue on my awesome Saturday and probably keep the buzz going until I pass out at 6 p.m. So what I find really interesting about what you've written about and who you are as a person is you started your journey off as towards your PhD as a pretty fundamentalist Christian. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct.
Could you give us a bit of a rundown on just like your journey? I guess, like, how did you become a Christian? How did you get involved in wanting to study the Bible formally? And then eventually we'll talk about what kind of shifted in your faith.
Yeah, sure. So, I grew up in a very fundamentalist evangelical household. My parents are both evangelical Christians, 6 literal days of creation, the earth is 6,000 years old, all those things. Evolution is satanic. And my grandparents on my mother's side were like, he was a ordained minister at one point. But they were, I think, in a lot of ways responsible for, training me up in the way that I should go. Right. And so, I don't remember a lot about my childhood. But I do remember being 5 or 6 years old and having been told on a fairly regular basis that I was going to hell. And I remember sitting on my bunk bed one night and just crying and thinking, I don't want to go to hell. And of course, I knew by that point the plan of salvation quite well. And so, for all those, Christians out there listening that are doubting whether I was really saved, I knew that I was a sinner and that the penalty for my sin was death. That would be separation from God and eternity in hell. And that there was nothing that I could do because I was a sinful person to bring about my own salvation and be forgiven of my sin. But that Jesus Christ had done that on the cross to pay the penalty for my sin. Once paid, always, once saved, always saved. The penalty was paid. And so all I had to do was trust that his death on the cross atoned for my sin, and that I would be sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise till the day of redemption. And so I asked for that free gift of salvation and got it. And I know that sounds crazy, maybe, that I understood all of that when I was 5, but I pretty well did. And that was the majority of my life. I was very much into intrinsic religiosity, right? I think I'm using that correctly, but it wasn't that religion was something that was sort of attached to me or alongside my life, but it was everything about my life. So, as a teenager, driving to work, like I would remember praying, "Oh Lord, let me get a parking spot," and then a parking spot appears. "Oh, thank you, Lord, for providing that parking spot." Or I didn't want to speed, even though I was late. And I said, "Lord, I trust you. You don't want me to speed. I'll get there on time if you want me to." So I'm very much into studying the biblical text. Of course, I grew up in church, and I went to youth group all the time, went on missions trips. I was sort of your stereotypical evangelical Christian. And at 17, I joined the Air Force and immediately started, when I got to my first duty station, started teaching a Bible study, which was so dorky, but I did it. And I eventually, while I was on active duty, got my bachelor's degree in religion from Liberty University, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very fundamentalist evangelical university here in the U.S. And I then applied to an officer chaplain program in the Air Force and got commissioned as an officer and started seminary. And went through 6 years of full-time seminary, got a master's in theology, in Old Testament studies. At the same time, I was pastoring a church out in Virginia as an associate pastor. And again, all of these were very much fundamentalist, interpretations of the text. And when I was about to finish, I was pretty good with the languages, the biblical languages. And I had a professor tell me it would be a waste if you didn't go get a PhD and try to get it in Hebrew or Old Testament or something, like that. And so I applied to the program at Johns Hopkins University. They have what's called an Assyriology program. And where I minored in Hebrew Bible as well, because I had an extensive background in it. And when I got in, very quickly, I was confronted in a way that I had never been confronted before with the wider languages and cultures of the ancient Near East, including their mythologies. And at the same time, I was learning Akkadian, I was learning Sumerian. So I was able to read these texts that sort of stand behind the biblical texts. And, then at the same time, learning the historical, the historical information about the ancient Near East and the Levant, and realizing over and over again that it just doesn't, in so many ways, particularly early on, match up with the Old Testament. And so about halfway through my first semester at Johns Hopkins, I became an atheist. I remember which class it was. It was the class on the Philistines. And, we know when the Philistines got to Canaan, and it's not when the Bible says they did. And I just remember that was the thing that sort of drove me to take a big step back and to look at all of the data objectively, or more objectively than I had been, and to determine, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true, but it sure doesn't seem like it is. And so I became an atheist. And then after a couple of years, sort of settled into like an agnostic position. But yeah, that's sort of that's the flow. That's how it went.
That's incredible. So was it like the straw that broke the camel's back, or was it like, because I can't imagine you'll be like, an on fire Christian, you're praying as you drove into university that day, and then that one class happened and you're like, well, now I'm an atheist. Like, was the straw?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So it was, I guess, a bit of both, right? The process for the straw that broke the camel's back was not long. So the story that I like to tell is I taught biblical Hebrew and exegetical principles using Hebrew for the last 2 years that I was in seminary. I was an adjunct professor there. And I remember I got accepted to Hopkins, which was a huge deal. And the dean of students for the seminary, on my last day of teaching Hebrew, I was walking out with my big stack of books. And he said, well, are you ready? Because, Johns Hopkins is a pretty liberal university. And I held up my Hebrew Bible in my hand, and because that's what I had with me. And I said, I'm going into the lion's den, but I'm going to win souls for Christ. And I remember when I started at Hopkins, that was definitely the mentality that I had going in.
Yeah.
And I remember like the first week, there was a bit of a lag in some of the Assyriology classes that they were offering. And so I ended up taking a bunch of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament courses instead, sort of filling in the gaps with those. And so I was, very close to all the Hebrew Bible students that were in the department. And one of them in particular, a good friend of mine named Andrew, he was in his third year at the time. And, we got to talking and he learned my background and he said, "Oh, this will be very interesting." And I said, "What will?" And he said, "Well, it'd be interesting to see how long you last." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, somebody with your background, your interpretation of the text, this isn't going to last very long for you." And I said, "Oh, you wrong guy. You don't know me." And every week, it probably took 6 weeks total. And every week I'd come into class, and before class would start, he'd turn around, he'd look at me and say, "How you doing?" And I'd say, It's okay. Because if you get it a little bit at a time, you can can do apologetics, right? You can sort of, well, isn't it possible that? But the way that it was happening for me was every week it was several things that were new and several things that were problematic. And then finally that one class, it was just something that was so stark. It was so in your face that it was like, all right, that's it. I can't hold it anymore.
Wow.
So relatively speaking, it was pretty quick. But it does feel like over this, a lot happened in that 45-minute period of time during that class. So I guess it was a little bit of both, but
it's actually interesting because I wonder, like, I haven't studied. I've done a cert for in ministry college. Like, in ministry, it was very, very, very ministry-esque. But I wonder, like, when it comes to academic scholarship, things like that, and studying the Bible and stuff, I wonder why is it so different from like a liberal university versus the studies you've done prior? Like, what, like, surely they have the same text, the same information. How is it approached differently?
Yeah. So there are some sort of key, principles that are held on to in evangelicalism. One of them is the inerrancy of the text. That's a huge thing, right? The Bible is inspired and it is inerrant. Now, there's debate about how we define inerrancy and what counts as inerrant and all these things. But, the reality is once you connect together, and this is just in my experience, but once you connect together, this book is inspired by God and it is in some way inerrant. You have commitments. And you have commitments that they're not so easy to shake and still hang on to them. So there are, ways that people can, sort of deal with problematic passages, particularly in the Old Testament. So, and still try to maintain some form of inerrancy. But the reality is that position is very, very strong in fundamentalism. And so you'll have like verbal plenary inspiration down to like the grammatical forms that are used in the original autographs, whatever that means, the original autographs. But when you have that level of commitment, now it's like, well, and oftentimes in fundamentalist interpretations, they don't respect genre maybe as much as they should. Or let me say it this way: they don't respect genre sometimes as much as maybe slightly more liberal evangelicals would like. And so what ends up happening is just, well, it says here that God created in 6 days, and so God created in 6 days. And it says that, Methuselah lived, 969 years. And so here it is, 969 years. And you can sort of do the calculations, right? And figure out the age of the earth. And of course, more mainstream evangelicals will tell you things like, no, you have to read this, in its ancient Near Eastern context. And I agree.
Oh, the word context. That was, yeah.
And that's true,
so
right? The problem, and we can talk about this, as we go through, but I mean, the problem with context is it becomes sort of a catch-all, like a get out of jail free card, right? Well, you just, you read a really problematic passage about slavery, and well, you just have to understand the broader context. Yeah, well, help me understand the broader context, my guy.
That's it's funny. It's funny you mention that example, because that's exactly what, like, I understand you definitely need to understand all this in context, and that's why I love your book so much, is because I think you do a very honest portrayal of, like, I've only started the Atheist Guide to the Old Testament, but which is amazing, by the way. I'm loving it more than the slavery book one. But the slavery book, I read it for the second time in preparation for this interview, and it's so balanced. Like, it's so in the middle of the road. You say atheists get things wrong here, Christians, fundamentalists get things wrong here. This is what the scholars tend to say, and I really appreciate that. And so I started making, like, TikToks or random videos about slavery, and everyone would say that you just don't understand the context, and I would just reply, "Can you tell me the context?"
Yeah,
and then ghost, like, I just disappeared. I wouldn't hear from them again. And this is multiple people, like 10, 15 people. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what's the context? If I don't know the context, tell me. Or they'll even say, you don't know the context. And I say, well, can you tell me the context? And one lady got back and said, it's better you go read the context yourself. And I said, I have. Like, what do you mean?
I've become sort of a terrible human being on TikTok. So I started this at the request of a couple of people. I started a TikTok account or channel or something called Not Kent Hovind.
And I am the biggest fan of that. My wife is sick of me singing the rap. Like, well, my name's Kent Hovind, coming back in T-Rex. Yeah, I lost it. Like, that's amazing. I
need to put out more content. I have to think of things to say, and it's tough to do.
You just need to do those little yes, yes.
Well, let me tell you, David. So.
I'll whack you, set you straight. It's so good, so good.
But I take that account now. Like, when I go on and scroll through, I'll scroll through the lives that are going on, and I'll get Bible studies. And so here I am. I'm not Joshua Bowen, I'm not like Digital Hummarabi. I'm this goofy account, Not Kent Hovind, right? So there's some anonymity. And so I'll go in there and they'll be, talking about, oh, God is, the God of the Old Testament is so amazing. And I'll say, yeah, so why do you think that he endorsed slavery in the laws of the Old Testament? And that's the number one thing you hear, right? Oh, you don't understand the context. And I'll say, oh, well, could we read it out loud right now? Block.
Yeah. I know. And I can see from their perspective, they would just assume you're a troll or something.
Right. Which I guess I am, but
yeah, I guess. But it's just amazing that, like, it's hard to have these conversations. Like, you can't ask them for context about slavery or genocide and not appear like a troll. Like, it's so, how do you do that? How do you go, like, hey, can we talk about God's genocide stuff? Like, and it always comes across like you're trying to pick a fight. And
right.
Anyway, it's an amazing story. How did you handle emotionally kind of having such a shift in your I guess identity?
Very difficult. And almost ironically, I have a friend named Mark, and Mark and I went to seminary together, just outside of DC, and we were best friends. Like we learned Hebrew together. We used to lock ourselves in a room with a Hebrew grammar and a Hebrew dictionary, Hebrew English dictionary, and we would say no English for the next 3 hours, and we would just speak Hebrew to each other. We were so dorky.
Wow.
But it really helped, obviously, to sort of immerse yourself that way. But that's how close we were. And I was telling you earlier, like I have multiple sclerosis, and it does some wonderful things to my brain chemistry and my neurology that I don't understand completely. But one of the things that I get is massive amounts of anxiety. And I was married at the time I was going to Hopkins, and we lived out in Virginia. And so I was driving an hour and 45 minutes into the campus, and then renting out this little apartment on North Howard Street so that I could be on campus, 5 days a week, and then drive back home on the weekends. And it's very difficult for me, particularly by myself, to live in the city. It was anxiety inducing for me. And he would come up every Thursday evening. It was my last class for the week. And he would pick me up in his car, and we'd drive out to Uno's Pizza, and we'd get a pizza, and we'd just talk. And pretty quickly it became clear that I was, sliding away from the faith. And of course he was not. And so we would have these really candid conversations. We'd walk around a parking lot at night, or we'd walk around this place called Ellicott City, get a coffee, and just talk things through. And so ironically, that was actually really helpful for me, because it was he was a sounding board for me to sort of transition and walk through why it is that I have these problems, and to listen to him honestly without a lot of judgment. And it was actually really useful and really nice. But my family is all still very fundamentalist, evangelical, and I love them to death, and they love me, but it doesn't mean I don't hear about it, or, get prayed for all the time, and get told that I get prayed for all the time. I've been called by certain members of my family, I've been called some pretty rough things. We put out a video, a recent research series is what we called it. And there's a professor up at Harvard named Don Dershowitz, who wrote an article in 2017 about homosexuality in the book of Leviticus. And it's a complicated argument, but he's making the argument that originally that passage in Leviticus 18 wasn't about same-sex relationships, but was about incest, and implicitly condoned same-sex relationships. And so I did this short little video, popular level video, and is basically saying, look, it looks like Leviticus may have originally condoned same-sex couplings.
Ooh, that's a spice. That's going to get the fundamentalists mad.
Yeah, and I won't mention who, but someone in my family who I love dearly, very, very close to me, called me a pervert. And it was just really, really rough. So those sorts of things, those sorts of things they still exist. But it's getting better. It's getting better. I guess I am open about these things. I'm currently in therapy with a religious trauma specialist. That's what he specializes in, to sort of, keep working through these, fears about hell, right? Because if anybody's grown up in fundamentalist evangelicalism, hell is a very real threat, right? And it's often what drives you to the faith and keeps you there. And I have some very deeply incised ruts in my brain where I can know the ancient Near East. I'm presenting a paper at a conference here in July on the background to death and the afterlife in the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. So it's not like I don't know about where hell came from and where it developed and all those things, the idea of it. But that doesn't mean that at night I don't sometimes lie down and say, man, what if this is just the wisdom of this world? What if this is just man's wisdom? What if I am being blinded by Satan and this is just all part of it, right? And it's a very real thing. So I'm working with a professional to sort of work through some of those things. So
I often say for myself that, there was a stage in my life where, people were asking, would you do this for God? Would you do that for God? Would you do this for God? And I said, listen, I would do anything for God. Like, I would die for God. I would, do absolutely anything. Like, nothing was off limits. If I knew it was God telling me to do something, I'd do something. And it was such a hard shift. But for me, I've got a little bit of, I don't know if you call it religious trauma, but I was definitely affected by, church's purity culture or Christianity's purity culture. And for the first, like, my wife and I were Christians up until we were married and a bit further past that. And the first time we slept together was on our wedding night. Like, having sex was fun and everything. But for the first few years, I would have intense anxiety before we had sex, and after having sex, about 9 out of 10 times, like I'd feel bad or wrong or guilty, or I couldn't understand why I was anxious, but I was just anxious. And it was such a horrible way to start a marriage and start that level of intimacy, because it was just, and all I can put it down to is the purity culture in church, and especially that book, Every Man's Battle, and that whole series. That series.
I taught that series when I was a pastor.
So did I. Yeah. I know.
Gosh.
And it's so, like, I remember watching the DVD series of Every Man's Battle, and it was like this one, it was like they're interviewing Ted Bundy, and he's like, you know what? All the serial killers here, they watch porn, and then
that's the connection.
Or there's this one guy, and he's like, he was a teenager, and he watched so much porn that he found that he was turned gay, and and I was like, whoa, and like, I remember talking to my secular friends, and I was saying things like why you got so much anxiety around like sex and porn and stuff? Like, this is when I was a teenager, and I was like, I just don't. And I used to make a joke, and I was like, I just don't want to end up behind a bar giving some dude a blowjob. And he's like, what? Like, his mind's like, where do you get this connection from? And I look back, I'm like, because of all this, like,
that's rare.
Yeah. Yep. Eventually you just won't be able to control yourself, and you'll be sleeping with dogs and bestiality and homosexuality. Like, it's disgusting.
Yeah. Obviously
the bourbon has taken effect. I've started to rant a little bit, but
that's good.
Good. Well, your story, that's an amazing story, but I did actually want to touch on an academic overview of Assyriology. But before we do that, I noticed you have a little plaque behind you. Behind that, and what is that?
This guy?
Yeah.
So this is a painting of what's called the Mushkhushu dragon. And it's an Akkadian word, but it comes from a Sumerian word, like the fierce dragon. And it's on the Ishtar Gate. So this is the original painting, but this is one of the figures that's on the Ishtar Gate in Nebuchadnezzar II's palace. The gate. You can see it online if people Google it. But this particular painting was done by Christina Blackfeather, who's a fan of ours, and she painted it live on her channel, and it took several. I mean, it's pretty big. Let me back up so you can get some perspective. So I'm 6'2".
Oh, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's
That's
pretty big. Yeah. And she painted it live and then sent it to us for free, along with one of 2 prints that she made. And Megan runs a nonprofit organization called Humans Against Poor Scholarship, which gives scholarships to PhD students to get through the summer when they don't get funding. And she said, I'd like you to keep the original painting and sell one of the prints, and whatever money you make from it, have that be my donation to the HAPS, the Humans Against Poor Scholarship program. And this is incredibly generous, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So we put it right here in the background. So every video that we do, people get to see her work.
Well, it's I wasn't sure if it had anything to do with this, but I'm going to share my screen. My wife and I, part of I think it was part of what opened our eyes to the broader picture of other religions and stuff. We went on a world trip, ended up in Berlin, ended up in a museum, and we ended up in front of this.
That's it.
Wow. So we have no idea what this is. We're just standing in front of it like, wow, this is an important thing.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the original or all the way over in Berlin.
Yeah, I've not been to that museum, but I think that is the original.
Yeah, I think because it was like a museum for Middle Eastern kind of things. Yeah, but yeah, it looks so similar when I first saw your channel.
That's what it is.
That must be.
That's exactly what it is. Cool. Yep.
That's so cool.
Like there are different animals.
Yeah.
But
look at the absolute ignorance of what I'm standing in front of. Like, I wish I could go back now and
educate some people. Like you probably don't even know what this is.
You don't even know what this is. Yeah, exactly.
Did you even lift, bro?
Yeah, exactly. Do you even scholar? So I'd love for you to explain to the audience, what is Assyriology?
So maybe to sort of very briefly, it is the study of the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq and Syria for the most part.
And they're our oldest civilizations, right?
They are. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you're defining civilization, I guess, but it's the oldest writing comes from Mesopotamia.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, first cities, those sorts of things. So the period of time that we study is pretty broad. It runs from roughly 3000 BCE down to the time of Alexander the Great, down around 330. But it's throughout that entire area, and it's broader than that, right? Because Assyriologists can, study areas up in Turkey, but it's or over in Iran, but it's that whole area there of Iraq and Syria and the regions immediately adjacent to it. Which means that most Assyriologists will study Akkadian, the languages of Akkadian and Sumerian, and the texts that are written in those languages. So the name comes from ancient Assyria, which was, over in Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia means the land between the 2 rivers. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, if you can picture Iraq, the head of the Persian Gulf, and then those 2 rivers that kind of split and go up.
I frantically started Googling my history because I knew nothing about Assyriology, Mesopotamia, nothing. I'm always been really bad at history. And last night, I'm like frantically like, all right, the Euphrates River. And
if people are interested, chapter 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament is it's a history of the ancient Near East, focusing on Mesopotamia, or from the Mesopotamian perspective. And then book 2, volume 2, which is getting ready to come out here in a couple of months, I give the history of the ancient Near East from the Egyptian perspective, so focusing in on Egyptian history. And then book 3, which will be the final book in the series, we'll give it from the Levantine, like the Syro-Palestinian perspective. So ancient Israel, their perspective. So should be good. I think. I hope.
Well, I'm up to that chapter, and it's been an amazing book so far. And obviously, links are in the description for all your work. The audiobook's great for the slavery book, and the Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. And it's not just atheists either, because because what I find a lot with Christian texts is they layer it with so much theology that you don't get a lot of the history. Like, so it's like, it seems sometimes like 50% theology, 50% history, and you don't know what if the history has been twisted to kind of match the theology. Where what I love about this book is Christians could read it and just get a very, very entertaining and simple overview of very complex issues about the Old Testament.
One of the things that, we all have biases. There's no question about that. And, nobody in academia that I know, Christian or atheist or whatever, would say that they don't have biases. I mean, you can't get away from biases. The struggle is to sort of fight against them, right? And one of the problems with apologetics, Christian apologetics in particular, but of course in any other apologetic field, is that you can't be strictly you can't try to be as unbiased as possible. There's only a certain amount of unbiased that you can be, because there are fundamental things that you have to hold to, right? Because you're starting in a lot of ways, you're starting with a conclusion. Yeah. And you're having to hold to that. Even if that conclusion is this is the inspired word of God. If that's the case, you already have serious commitments. And so what I realized that this was definitely a marketing strategy, calling it the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It's definitely marketed and geared toward atheists and skeptics, because the way that the books are written, they're saying, look, if you're having discussions with family members, with people online, if people at work that are saying things like the Bible is, like the Old Testament is so different than any of the other stuff that we see in the ancient Near East, and all the peoples in the ancient Near East were really barbaric, but the Bible is really progressive, and actually slavery is not slavery, and violence, that was totally justified when God annihilated entire ethnic groups. That was okay because they were really sinful. If you're having those discussions, that's who the book is for. The book is for you to get a broad, somewhat deep introduction to the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible, but then to be armed with information about these specific topics, like slavery, like who wrote the Pentateuch, like the prophecy against the city of Tyre that failed in Ezekiel, those sorts of things. But the reality,
Josh.
No, definitely not. Of course,
because prophecies can't fail, so therefore
that's right.
Fail.
They can't. I mean, that's how it works, right?
Yeah.
But for me, the point I guess I'm trying to drive at incredibly slowly, and I apologize for that, is while I have biases that are often brought about just by my life experience, where I'm from, the fact that I'm a white male in 2000 or 2022. I have biases that some that I'm aware of, some that I'm not aware of. But I don't compound that with some of these other, I think, incredibly much more problematic biases. And so when I write this book, I can say things like, atheists get this wrong. right? And Christian apologists get this wrong. Look, these are the data points. This is what we're all looking at. This is what we're all working with. Here are the models. None of them say Moses wrote the Pentateuch, right? Outside of fundamentalist evangelicalism or the types of evangelicalism, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. I think that's an important distinction to make.
Oh, you kind of just answered one of the questions for the Q&A, but
sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. We can touch on it again. So, how does it relate to biblical? How does Assyriology relate to biblical studies?
Yeah.
Big sip of bourbon.
Sorry.
No. It's like,
that's a tough one. So, the earliest attestation that we have for Israel in history comes from 1207 BCE, and there's a stele called the Merneptah stele, and it's Pharaoh Merneptah is doing a campaign into Canaan, and he says, "I conquered and wiped out this people group called Israel." So that's the earliest that we got. We don't really have anything until the 9th century, 10th century. But several 100 years later. And so Israel is part of a cultural tapestry that goes way back earlier than Israel's history. So, if you think about, if you picture a map of the ancient Near East, you've got the Mediterranean Sea over here, and I guess it would be for you, it'd be over here. Can't tell how this mirrors, but on one side you have the Mediterranean and Israel over here, and then on the other side you have the head of the Persian Gulf, and you have Mesopotamia here. This whole area has such a rich history, and writing appears at the end of the 4th millennium in Mesopotamia. We start getting economic and administrative texts. And then pretty soon into the 3rd millennium, you're getting mythological texts. You're getting, it really get literature, and it really develops. And then by the time you get to the early 2nd millennium, you just have this explosion of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. And we're still 700 years before the first mention of Israel. And so, the Israelites were Canaanites from the land of Canaan. And they developed out of the mythology, part of, you can see it in the Hebrew Bible, very, there's a lot of background, Canaanite background. And so you also have an awful lot of influence on the Hebrew Bible from Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamian literature, Akkadian literature, like the flood story is the great example. If you read through the Akkadian story of Atrahasis from the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, and you compare that to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, which is from maybe 500 years later, that story, those versions of the flood story are it's what the Hebrew Bible writers, what the scribes used. And I have a chapter on that in volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook. And it's more than just the literature, right? If you read through Exodus 21, for example, in the part of the Covenant Code, you'll see striking resemblances to the laws of Hammurabi, right? So even the way they organize and think about things like case law. If you ever read through, Exodus or Deuteronomy, if such and such happens, then such and such will happen as a result. These if-then, they call this casuistic law. Well, this comes from Mesopotamia. So the reason that there's such a strong connection here, and it's so useful and so relevant to studying the Hebrew Bible, is that the Hebrew Bible, it was not handed down from on high in a vacuum, right? It's pulling from, it's utilizing, it's reworking and reshaping literary and mythological traditions and cultural traditions, and even like legal rationale that had been in the area for thousands of years. And so understanding all of that background, then coming to the Hebrew Bible, it sets it all in its context, and it sets it so you can sit down and you can read, for example, when you read through the conquest narrative of the book of Joshua, and you see these what scholars have pointed out are probably hyperbolic statements, right, about wiping absolutely everybody out. Well, if you read through Sennacherib's inscriptions about what he does, this Neo-Assyrian king, you see that he says similar stuff, right? It's a way that they speak. Now that gets abused, tremendously abused. I write about it in the second book. I have a chapter on violence and genocide in the Old Testament. But the point is that you can understand genre, you can understand where they're getting individual themes or motifs from, and that helps you understand what the text itself is doing. And I'll give one very brief example that I develop a lot in the book. If you read through Genesis 1 through 11, which is called the primeval history, there's a progression. And if you think about it, particularly starting in the Eden narrative, mankind is created very much in line with the animals, right? There's a close connection between man and the animals, right? The man is created, and then the animals are created, and they're brought before him to see who's going to be a helper. And no helper is found. But then woman is created, and the man and the woman are naked. They're unashamed. This is very much akin to what you see in the Epic of Gilgamesh with the character of Enkidu. Enkidu is this wild man who's unclothed. He's out roaming, in the steppe. The progression in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though, is toward civilization, right? Enkidu becomes, has sex with a woman for 7 days and becomes human, becomes civilized. He puts on clothing, he eats bread, he drinks beer. Then he goes to the major city of Uruk and he meets, Gilgamesh, and everything is all about moving toward the pinnacle of civilization, which is the city, right? Everything moves toward the city, and it's all positive movement toward the city. It's like, this is what we should be striving for. Well, if you understand that and then go read Genesis 1 through 11, you have movement, similar movement from innocence, nakedness, toward Genesis 11, which is the Tower of Babel story, toward the city. And notice it's Babylon, the Tower of Babylon, the city of Babylon.
Whoa.
But that movement is all negative, right? Think about the movement toward, the people following Cain and Abel, right? They get more civilized. They're building cities, but it's all bad, right? They all fall into sin. Everybody's wicked. Then Yahweh starts over with Noah and his sons. And what do they immediately say? It starts moving again towards civilization. And ultimately it coalesces, it climaxes in this city and Tower of Babel, which is the worst thing possible. And what does Yahweh do? Right? They all come together. They want to build a tower up to heaven. It's a smack in the face to this ideal that the Mesopotamians had of the city and civilization. And what does he do? He scatters them. And who does he pick? He picks Abram, pulls him from where? Out of Ur of the Chaldees, out of Mesopotamia, pulls him out with his family. And what do they do the rest of his life? They wander around. They wander around in tents, right? It's a polemic. It's a direct polemic against Mesopotamian concepts of ideal civilization.
Wow.
And so if you can understand that, if you can, if we can get and again, I write about this in more detail in the book, but if we can sort of wrap our heads around that, then it becomes clear this isn't a matter of plagiarism, right? It's not that the Old Testament writers, it's not that the Judean scribes are going, okay, I'm lifting this story, because they didn't have a concept of plagiarism. There's no moral component to this. There aren't like intellectual ideas that are owned by people. Rather, what they're doing is the example that I always give is they're acting like Eminem, right? If you listen to one of Eminem's albums, more recent albums, he reworks so many different artists. The song that always pops to mind is Remind Me. It's the example that I always give. But it's a reworking of Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll. And you can hear how he reworks it. The music itself is a replay of it, a reworking of it, and some of the ideas. It's not that he's plagiarizing, right? He's pulling it for a very specific effect. And that's how we have to think about this. We have to think about, what are they doing? Why is it that Genesis 1 sounds so goddamn similar to the Enuma Elish, right? To the ascendancy of Marduk? Why are there hints all over the place that it's like it, right? It's pulling from it. It's because it's a polemic, right? It's trying to say, we know what you guys think. Yahweh did it, not Marduk. Yahweh's better, not Marduk. And here's how we're showing that.
Okay, so you've blown my mind. You've blown my mind.
None of those are my ideas, by the way, just so it's clear. Yeah, there's a great article by Ron Hendel that talks about that progression. He's one of the scholars that's written on that. But
that's amazing. That like everything clicks a lot more. I did actually want to push back on, like, I flick back into my fundamentalist mind for a second to try and think about how someone may try and push back on what you're saying.
Sure.
I've heard, or maybe, so we know historically that, I mean, it's a whole other thing to say, did the Exodus happen and all that stuff, but we know historically when these books were written differs from the theological ideas of when these things happened, right? So like, it might say the Exodus happened, like your Bible, it might say the Exodus happened probably 2000 BC or something. I don't know what the actual dates are, 1500 BC.
15th century.
Yeah. And so that's what the theological claim is. I know that there are some problems historically with the Exodus, were they ever in Egypt? We can get into that at another point. But for a theologian, couldn't a theologian say that, no, these were oral traditions that the Mesopotamians started writing down, got some few things wrong, but God kept the oral tradition alive in what would become the Israelites, and then when they did write it down, they wrote it down the way God first intended, and so it was like the cart before the horse kind of thing.
So usually, what goes along with that is, there was an actual worldwide flood, right? That's sort of the linchpin to that. That's why it goes that way. And so the problem that you have to wrestle with, there are many, but just in the field of humanities, the problems that you have to wrestle with, if you're going by that, more fundamentalist biblical approach, the flood's supposed to happen sometime in the middle of the third millennium, right? We know a lot about the middle of the third millennium. We have a lot of original, like extant cuneiform clay tablets from that period. And you can like go to an archaeological site and dig down into the early Bronze Age, like down into the third millennium. And we have we know what's going on. It's not a mystery. So that's one thing that you have to contend with. Probably the bigger problem, I think, besides the fact that you have to have Sargon of Akkad establish the Akkadian Empire, the old Akkadian Empire, 20 years after all of humanity has been wiped out. Other than that,
and you're not talking about the YouTube Twitch person who time travels back in time. You're not talking about Sargon of Akkad, the Twitch
no,
streamer,
not that guy. Not that guy.
Cool.
The original. But the other thing that you have to wrestle with, just thinking more about the textual tradition, is that we actually don't see flood stories, Mesopotamian flood stories, appearing until right around 2000. In other words, it's not that there's been this tradition that's been carried on since the middle of the third millennium, and because we have writing, we have mythologies, we have stories, literature put down. Nothing is said. In fact, we have what's called the Sumerian King List, and the Sumerian King List is a late third millennium. It was probably written sometime in the late third millennium, but there's an earlier version of it that doesn't have the flood story. Later, there's a line that says after the flood swept over, right? So it's appended, or it's added to the Sumerian King List. But those traditions don't start, we don't see them in the literary record or in the textual record until just after 2000 BCE. So what you'd have to argue is that not only do we not see it anywhere in Canaan until well into the first millennium, right? And that there's just some oral tradition, but that the Mesopotamians, who were also at the center of this and have the exact same goddamn story, down to individual vocabulary words, by the way, they just went 500 years without saying anything about it. Their entire civilization was destroyed, even though we have no record of that. We have lots of record of the civilization continuing right on through. But they saw this global flood, this worldwide flood, and went, ho hum, let's hold off in talking about that for half a millennium.
Right.
It's to say that it strains credulity is very generous, I think.
It's also one of those things where, like, the flood is such a fun thing to talk to fundamentalists with, because it's so obviously, like, I live in Australia, I went through and counted all the endemic species that we have in Australia, like things that, not including birds or fish, because they could fly and swim from Mount Ararat all the way to Australia. 19,601 might have been the endemic species we have in Australia. So, and I have two friends who work for, who have worked and work for the Wildlife Hospital, Steve Irwin's zoo's hospital that's just down the road. And they've given me tours of the koala enclosures and stuff. And they're like, koalas can't get the specific type of eucalyptus leaves that they want. They will choose to die in the tree rather than eat a type of eucalyptus leaf they
Good night.
want. And so, like, they're so dumb, like, as in regarding to a species. It's amazing that they've survived this long, and all their brain power has gone to taking the nutrients from. I mean, I'm not a biologist or whatever, but that's what I've heard. And even, like, at different stages in their life, they'll eat the shoots, they'll eat older leaves. If they're feeling sick, they'll eat different species of leaf, and they'll eat it further up the tree. And I've heard apologists say, maybe with koalas, they had other foliage and they sprayed eucalyptus oil that Noah had made that wasn't written down. And I'm like, at what stage, or I remember mentioning it to a family member, mentioning this to a family member, and I said, what about the problem with Noah's flood and something? And they said, well, maybe God just created the animals after, like, maybe he just repopulated the earth with the animals. And I said, well, what's the point of the ark? Right. I was and also, you're just making stuff up now. Like, that's not mentioned anywhere. So, yeah, it's always a fun topic to talk about, because it's like, I mean, I don't mean to be crude to anyone who may believe this, but it fails on every single level, if you take it literally.
And this is what's sort of frustrating to me. I was watching a Twitter thread with someone who was making an abductive argument. I'm not a philosopher, but someone who was making an abductive argument about morality in the Old Testament. And somebody was arguing against them, critiquing their abductive argument like a deductive argument. And of course, in a deductive argument, I say, of course, like, the hell do I know about philosophy?
I'm kind of following along.
It's so abductive is like the evidence leads to the most reasonable conclusion or something like that. It's like there's another way to say it, but it's not a premise one, premise two, therefore it necessarily follows premise three. Mm-hmm. That's deductive. argument to the best explanation, I think is what it's called. But they were saying, well, it's not impossible that X could be true, therefore I win. Which if you're saying that this is my deductive proof that this is the case, and you can find a chink in the armor of one of the premises, fine, then that proof fails. But that's not what the guy was doing. The guy was saying, well, you have an immutable God in the Old Testament who's commanding genocide or commanding slavery, something that we know to be immoral. That seems like that God isn't real, right? And they were saying, well, isn't it
wrote down the wrong thing, or maybe they weren't hearing from God? Yeah, but yeah.
Right. But this is the sort of thing with apologetics, right? It's I wrote a chapter in volume 1 on the dating of the book of Daniel. And Daniel gets a lot of details wrong, and he gets some bigger stuff wrong too. But one of the things that he says is that Belshazzar, who was the son of Nabonidus, the Neo-Babylonian king, was actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar, which is just not true, right? And so an apologist will come back, and it's like clockwork. You can, if they know anything about it, they'll say, well, wait a minute, the word in Hebrew for son and father, those words can mean grandson and grandfather as well. You're like, yeah, but he wasn't his grandson either, right? Yeah, but he could have been, because, Nebuchadnezzar had a daughter that married Neriglissar, who was another Neo-Babylonian king. And it's possible, right, that maybe he had another daughter that also married Nabonidus, and that would make Nebuchadnezzar his grandfather. Well, if you're like, it's possible that it's possible that it's possible, and then that's what you're standing on, like, there's not a lot that I could do, right? Because what you've done is you've said, I need this conclusion to be correct. All I have to do is find a possibility. And that's not how it works.
The thing that bothers me about apologetics, and not to throw too much shade on the apologists, because I do have appreciation for some, especially Michael Jones. I really like Michael Jones. I think he's as honest of an apologist as you can be. But I still disagree with a lot of his conclusions, but I like him.
Michael and I are pretty good friends.
Oh, cool. Yeah. He's a good guy. He was on this podcast, and it was a really interesting conversation. And he also chose whiskey, which is interesting to be drinking whiskey with an apologist. But the whole field of apologetics. Sorry, it's all post hoc. No one arrives at their God belief from apologetics. No one goes like, well, actually, it's just trying to rationalize away the parts that don't seem to work. Like, just what are the reasons you have for belief? Like someone might say, "Oh, I grew up a Christian. I feel this in tremendous feeling. I had these spiritual moments and things like that." Like, they're the reasons you believe. If they're the reasons you believe, just say they're the reasons you believe. The whole apologetics field, there's a place for it. There is a place for it, but it just seems like the whole thing is post hoc. And you guess you can say that with a lot of things, but that's the problem I tend to have with a lot of these. Or like, Joseph's father. Who's Joseph's father? And it's like, well, they were using Mary's bloodline. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say they were using Mary's bloodline. It doesn't say they were using it, so, you can make anything up to fit if you believe the conclusions are true.
I guess maybe just to sort of, say one small thing about that, to drive it home. I have that chapter on violence and genocide in volume 2. And the way that I come at it, without giving like too much away, is basically the arguments that are made from Christian apologists, particularly people like Paul Copan, if you're familiar with him. And I like Paul. He's a nice guy. Like, I've had discussions with him, but obviously fundamentally disagree with him. But it's very common to say either the people that were genocided, the people that were slaughtered, deserved it, right? And God was really, really patient. Or it's hyperbole, right? And it wasn't that they were all wiped out. It's just like a lot of them were wiped out. That one is like, okay, that's not much better, but those are the two arguments, right? It's hyperbole or the people really deserved it. What I do in the chapter is I say, awesome. I'm going to give you some examples of Neo-Assyrian kings that do the exact same goddamn thing. Here are 3 Neo-Assyrian kings that have royal inscriptions that you can go look at. You can go look in the museum and sit there and look at them. And they say things like, Asher, my God, commanded me to go and to destroy this people group because he was very gracious and extended his benevolent arm to them. And they rebelled and they sinned and they were wicked. And so I had to go destroy them, right? And then just ask the question, how you feeling about that? You cool with, Tiglath-Pileser the third kicking ass and taking names, because his god Asher? No, of course not. Well, why? Yeah. All right. It's hyperbole.
It's not the one true God. That's
right.
That's the reason why.
Yeah. And now we're at special pleading.
Yeah. The fun special pleading. I did want to touch on slavery and morality of the Old Testament.
Of course.
And I want to be careful of your time because I don't want to keep you till midnight. Because I want to get through some slavery and morality stuff, and then we have a lot of questions from my Discord, people who are interested in what you had to say. But what I have done is I've gone through your Twitter over the last week or so, and just pulled some interesting conversations you've had with people. And before we start the slavery discussion, I want to read out some people's responses to you, just for the audience sake. So first up, I might bleep this, I might not. Austin said their names. Austin said, slavery allowed lives to be spared. With God allowing slavery, lives were saved. And freedom was also possible. An argument against is an argument in favor of murder.
Oh my God.
Someone said, you said, do you see a problem with slavery and beating them in a form of discipline? And then someone said, no, I don't see a problem. What's your objection? And then you said, easy mute.
Easy mute.
Andrew said, slavery in the Old Testament was for the benefit of both the slave owner and the slave. Michael responded by saying, Michael said, actually, slavery in the Old Testament isn't what one thinks of the word slavery today. So-called slaves had a lot of rights and are better described as some Hebrew word workers. And my favorite by far is, and we could have the whole podcast just talking about this person's tweet. The Sons of Light said, atheists. They made a atheist like a this. So atheists. This is what atheists say: slavery is wrong. Atheist also abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, fornication, etc. are right. Wow, and you said easy block. It's amazing because I know people I know people on both sides of the belief scale when it comes to abortion. Okay, I understand that issue. Some people, it's an icky issue for a lot of people, but homosexuality, transgenderism, and fornication are right. Well, they're not. For one, atheism isn't claiming that they're right. It is just. The whole thing is just amazing to listen to. What do you is this what you think slavery is the same as transgenderism, like someone identifying with who they feel they are, or fornication? What? I don't know.
There is a really good friend of mine, Jessica, who's you've probably seen her in those Twitter threads, Queen of Heathens.
I did. Yeah, she looks great.
She's an amazing person. And she has this thing that she says to these people, where she says those two brain cells competing for third. It's so perfect, because that's what I thought when I saw that. All right, guy.
That's
brain small.
It's amazing.
Brain small.
But it just seems everyone is coming after you at the moment in regards to slavery. I wonder why that is, because it's been a while since you wrote the book. So is it been like this whole time, or is it just recently?
Yeah, I don't remember what brought it up. I get tagged a fair amount. Scott, I can't remember Scott's last name, but he goes by Theoretical Bullshit on Twitter.
I think I know.
Super nice guy.
Yeah.
But he'll tag me in periodically or whatever it is, link me, I don't know what it's called, at me, and say, like, is this right, or what do you think about this? And that usually will start something. Or I'll put up a tweet, that says, like, please, stop with the slavery apologetics or something like that.
Mm.
And what people don't realize, and this is why this is so insidious. It would be very clear to everyone if I were to say, and let me say it this way: we did a debate. Matt Dillahunty and I did a debate with Stuart and Cliff Connectley on Modern Day Debate, maybe a year ago, and it was on slavery. And at one point, there was just so much of this. It wasn't as bad. The people were really wicked, and God was using this, and then, they were really poor, and it wasn't an ideal, and blah, blah, blah. And I remember at one point saying, listen, if right now someone broke into a house where there was a family of, mother, father, and 3 kids, and killed the mother, killed the father, and killed the 2 kids, but took like the 15-year-old daughter, and they set the house on fire and burned everybody inside of it except for the 14-year-old daughter or 15-year-old daughter, and took her captive, took her into a basement, chained her there, fed her terribly, but kept her as a prisoner over the next, 10, 15 years. Would you make the argument if somebody said that was a horrible person? Would you make the argument, well, I mean, like, they didn't let the 15-year-old burn in the house? I mean, like, it was a mercy. I mean, they could have just left her there, but no, they took her out. And look, they gave her food, gave her shelter, right? I mean, nobody would do
family,
that.
She would have been starving. She would have been on the streets.
Yeah, she'd have been out on the street. What would have happened to her? Yeah, they were providing for her. No, I mean, everybody recognizes immediately, like, well, it's, like, I'm uncomfortable having now told that story. But the point is that we don't feel that same way. Often Christian apologists don't feel that same way when they talk about things like slavery. And so what they end up saying, like, full-chested, well, when you bring up something like Exodus 21, 20-21, if a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately, and then they're to be punished, they're to be probably to be killed. But if the slave survives a day or two, then they're not to be punished because they're his property. And you will hear, 9 times out of 10, I will hear, well, wait a minute, like, they had to be able to beat them. I mean, how else were you supposed to motivate a slave? Once somebody says that, there's just this pause, because that's what happened with one of those tweets. The guy laid out what 20-21 means. And I said, yes, exactly. Then I hit a space and I said, please tell me that you see the problem with this. Like, no, what problem? The biggest problem, besides the fact that it's unbelievably disgusting, is that is the same. And I write about this in that slavery chapter in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. There is a very clear parallel between the legal rationale that we saw in the antebellum South and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. Because the same tension is there in both places. The judges are having to balance this. Well, we have slaves. Slaves are legal. Having slaves is legal. And we don't want masters to abuse them. And we don't want them to murder them, obviously. But they're slaves and they need to be motivated and corrected. And the master has the right to do that. And the way that we do that is by beating them with moderate correction, moderate physical correction. So how do we balance this? The master's right to beat and motivate his slave within reason and keeping the slave from being abused and killed. And the way that they develop this is, well, you're allowed to have moderate physical correction. It's the same thing that you see in Exodus 21, right? If you beat a male or female slave so severely that they die immediately, well, that's murder, that's abuse. There's severe punishment for that. However, if they don't die immediately, and there's some debate about whether that means they survive a day or two and then are able to get up. I tend to think the passage means they survive a day or two and then die. But if there's intervening time between when the beating took place and when the slave died or when the slave got back up, whatever, then the benefit of the doubt is given to the master that he was just doing corporal punishment, which he needs to be able to do according to the law. And what scares me so much about slavery apologetics is when you're making those arguments about Exodus 21, you're making the same fucking arguments about that people made about in the antebellum South. It's the same argument. And we know what happened there. Like there's no place maybe that's, at least in my day-to-day life, that this is the old adage of if you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. Right? And that's in these slavery discussions. It's just, that's why I take this so seriously, because you can't, once you start down the path of this book gives me my morals, then you end up having to defend really whatever it is that it says, whatever it is that it recommends. And so you end up having to say things like, well, Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29, if a guy, seizes and rapes a unbetrothed virgin, he's got to marry her. Well, I mean, that makes sense, right? I mean, like, hey, at least she's getting cared for the rest of her life. You're like, whoa, come on, man. Like, it's just so problematic. There's a last thing I'll say. There's a phenomenal book that was written by Professor John Collins up at Yale, who is just a hell of a nice guy and a brilliant Old Testament scholar. And the title of the book is What Are Biblical Values? And it's an easy read. It's 2019, 2020 publication. I think it's 19.
I'll link it in the description. It's
phenomenal. Worth every penny. And it's an easy read. It's not like it's going to really, you're not going to, people don't struggle through it. But he basically goes through what are biblical values, whatever that might mean. What does the Bible say about things like abortion, rape, slavery, homosexuality, those sorts? I think he touched on homosexuality. I can't remember, but he's talking about these major social issues and saying, what is the Bible's position on these things? And what will be surprising, I think, to many is that it's really bad by our modern moral standards. And I think we need to just engage with that and say, look, that's the ancient world. Whether we see the text as inspired or not, however we make that work, we can't say we're going to get our morals from this book that says that a rapist is marries his victim if she's unbetrothed and can't divorce her all the days of her life without the text has no consideration toward her feelings toward the matter at all. And it's such a dangerous precedent to set.
It truly is. And it sounds like a very interesting book too, because I made a video. You probably didn't hear about this over in the States, but a school that I used to actually, the principal of the school he used to be in a ministry position, and he signed my ministry certificate for my Cert 4. He amended the student contract, and this is a Christian high school, to say that they won't be honoring transgender pronouns and they won't accept homosexuals or bisexuals, like these things against God. And I made this video that kind of blew up a little bit, and I was like, look, that's fine, all right. Well, it's not fine, but don't call it biblical morals, because I'm sure you're not also teaching that it's okay to own other humans as property. I'm sure you're not teaching that that it's a sin to be divorced. I'm sure you're not teaching that. Like, I hope you're checking that your faculty no one in your faculty has been divorced before. I hope you're checking that your faculty, everyone believes in Yahweh and doesn't worship any other god. I hope no one has a little Buddha statue around their house, because these are all sins, right? And I was like, you're not teaching biblical morality. You're teaching your own morality from parts of the Bible you've just
that's exactly right
chose from.
Yep.
And that's the same thing with I've had two guests on this podcast. One of them was a good friend of mine who I met in ministry college, one of my best friends. He was closeted for 45 years because of that. And so he told his story about, I call it surviving gay conversion therapy, because he tried to pray the gay away for a long time, and he became suicidal in the end. And then the other guest I had Haley Brooke, she's a musician and a TikTok sensation, and same thing. She lost her entire family. She lost all her family except her sister and her uncle when she came out as a lesbian. And they all point to the Bible and the immorality and stuff, but it's like, be consistent. Like, I would still have an issue if you were to be bigoted, but at least be consistently bigoted.
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I mean? So it's like, it's so frustrating to see this kind of thing happening, and the apology. And the worst thing too is, it seems, the two things to just touch on. It seems like they'll always point the finger. These people will point the finger at atheists and say, "Where do you get your morals from?" and then they will argue that the slavery in the Bible isn't actually slavery. It's like, where are you getting that from?
Yeah.
Like, if you get your morality from the Bible, slavery is a-okay, it appears, right? But you're saying, no, didn't mean that. Well, you're obviously appealing to some other moral code you have inside you, some deeper feeling, some subjective feeling. You get them from the same place I do, except you just overextend yourself to the Bible or whatever. Yeah. And then, it's just and to one of your posts, actually, I replied, someone said, to the slavery was allowed to spare lives. God was allowing slavery. The arguments against it is an argument on murder. I just replied and said, how come we can come up with a better system today than an omniscient creator of the universe could come up with? Yeah. This doesn't seem... Yeah. I mean, stop teasing God. You're making God out to be really stupid, is what I said to these people. Stop teasing God. You're coming up with these crazy ideas about God, and it's not okay, bro. Yeah. So, yeah.
I agree.
Well, so just to touch on, for those who don't know, does the Bible talk about slavery? Does the Old Testament talk about slavery? And what type of slavery is that in the Old Testament?
Yeah, so there are three, but usually I just talk about the two. There's debt slavery, there's chattel slavery, and there's sex slavery. Debt slavery is simply slavery that is contingent upon a debt, the repayment of a debt. And so, the way that pans out in the Hebrew Bible is that if, and you can read about this in Exodus 21 and in Deuteronomy 15, if someone goes into debt and they can't repay it, they become a debt slave, which means that, people want to argue that it's, something like a sports contract or something, but you can't leave, right? I mean, you can't wake up 2 weeks in and be like, nah, you know what? I'm actually, this isn't really for me. I'm going to do something else here. I'll go work at McDonald's.
It was just spicy employment. That's all it was.
Right. They're kept. They can be beaten. They're admonished to be beaten, or masters are admonished to beat their slaves. And after serving for 6 years, that fulfills all of the debt repayment requirements, and they're turned loose. There are differences between Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. We don't have to get into those, but that's the general layout for debt slavery. Chattel slavery is simply slavery that is not contingent upon the repayment of a debt. So, for example, in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, a foreigner can be taken, be they a foreigner from around living in the nations around, or if they're like a tenant farmer living in the midst of the people. If they're taken as a slave, they're taken as a chattel slave. There is no like time of service, and then they're set free. They can be kept for life. The text is very clear. They can be passed on as inheritance, and made to serve forever. So chattel slavery is just that. It's slavery that's not contingent upon the repayment of the debt. You can also see this with Israelites. If you read Exodus 21, 2 to 6, it'll talk about if a debt slave comes in during his 6-year term of service and is given a wife, and that wife bears children, the wife and the children are the property of the master. That children is called those children are called houseborn children, and they're chattel slaves, right? There is no debt that their slavery is contingent upon. They're just born to a slave in the house, and so they're chattel slaves. That doesn't mean that they could never be freed. It's just that there's no requirement of the master to free them. And so those are the two types. There is sex slavery. Again, I tend to not go into it as much, but you can see it in like Exodus 21, 7 through 11, and in Deuteronomy 21.
Were these, I'm slipping back into my fundamentalist mode again. I'm trying to think of like how some of my family would ask questions, what questions they would ask. Would they, like, one question is, were these instructions from God, or were these possibly just man-made instructions?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you're asking the question, right? If you're asking it from a fundamentalist framework, and you're saying, I believe that the Bible is the inspired, God-breathed word, word of God, then no, these are absolutely from Yahweh, right? I mean, the text is explicit about it. If you read, for example, the beginning of Leviticus 25, it says, "Say unto the children of Israel these words," right? I mean, it's coming from Yahweh explicitly. If you're asking me outside of a fundamentalist framework, I'm saying, no, this is a human book, right? These are priests and scribes that are doing their thing, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There are people that try to make such arguments, but you have to fundamentally alter what inspiration means. Which, yeah, I'm fine with. Let me say this. I would much prefer somebody alter their idea of inspiration so that they don't argue that slavery is okay. Yeah. Let's do that. Let's do that, everybody.
Yeah. Your goal is less slavery apologetics.
Yes,
less
please.
Genocide and slavery apologetics, please. Yes. Yeah,
please.
I'm interested in how you would have responded to the slavery claims as a fundamentalist Christian versus now.
I don't know that. I don't know that I was ever confronted with them. I was what's called a dispensationalist, if you're familiar with that term.
No.
And basically, there's a huge emphasis on the distinction between the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. So, the law kills, right? Those passages in Paul's epistles, in places like Romans and Galatians, and those things are really emphasized. Like that's the Old Covenant, right? That's for Israel. But I don't know that I was ever really pressed on the specifics there. Had I been pressed, I would imagine that my response would have been, look, God has morally sufficient reasons, and his ways are higher than ours. Isaiah 55. Come on, don't you know? God, we can't get to God's level. So while we might not understand it, God's got a reason, and the same thing would be true for why he sent a worldwide flood to kill everybody, including innocent children. Well, maybe they weren't innocent somehow, right? God had a plan. Like these are the sort of trite responses.
I got invited into this Christian Discord server, and I asked her about these questions, and she said, "Well, maybe the babies had Nephilim. Maybe the infants that were to be slaughtered were Nephilim." Okay,
maybe,
maybe. I don't know. Yeah, there's always a way around it. Just to let's move on to the Q&A, because there's lots of questions.
Okay.
And we could keep talking this for ages, because it's so interesting. And I've just been sitting back and enjoying this lovely bourbon and
awesome,
and listening to you talk. The first question I wanted to ask, though, is, so this came from someone on my Discord server. What do you think about the scriptures that require the death penalty for specific sins? So, and versus, and I think what he was getting at was, so like, the homosexual sex, violating the Sabbath, cursing one's parents, require the death penalty. How do we interpret those scriptures? Like, how did you view them as a fundamentalist, and how do you view them kind of now? Are they actually calls to the death, like the stoning of someone for breaking the Sabbath?
I see. So much, I mean, if you think about where so many of these regulations are, or these laws are, they're in sections of holiness, right? So if you think about the holiness code in Leviticus, so much of, and again, this is not like my area of expertise. Joel Baden is a phenomenal scholar to talk to about this. But when you think about the holiness of the sanctuary, or the holiness of Israel as a people, any type of defilement that comes in, this is how it's met. So, like, think back to Joshua chapter 7. Israel has gone and conquered Jericho, and they've taken, Achan has gone in, and he's taken some of the gold and the silver and some garments and stuff. And that was all supposed to be, dedicated to destruction. And instead he took so many hidden under his tent. Well, the result was, once that was found out, there's impurity, right? He's essentially contaminated the camp. And so he's killed his whole family's killed, animals, everything, anything that was in his household. If you think about in 1 Samuel, when the Ark is being brought back, and I think it's in 1 Samuel. I always get the 1 and 2 Samuel conflated, but the Ark is being moved, and a man reaches up who's carrying it to steady the Ark, because it started, and he's struck down dead. Right? There's this separation, there's this purity, there's this holiness that is often simply met with death. Right? It's like a way of purifying, and not that that's the only reason. I haven't thought through that at any length, but so much of this is about holiness and sanctification and separation. So there's sin in the camp, right? There's sin in the camp. It's a phrase that it comes up, and so it has to be eradicated. So how do you do that? Often it's through death.
Okay. Wow. This one is actually from a Christian who has Sumerian heritage, and is I met on Omegle when I was doing some street epistemology stuff, and he's jumped on the Discord server as well, and he's sent so many questions through, actually, and this is the one he really wanted me to ask. What is your honest opinion of the theory of Assyrian continuity? Do you think it's entirely true?
I don't know exactly what he means by that. Is it that, like, modern day Assyrians are ethnically connected?
I think so. I was hoping you'd know what he was talking about.
If that's what he means, because there are Assyrians today, obviously, that would claim heritage back to, like ancient Assyrians. I'm not like a geneticist, so I don't know that side of it. I don't have any opinion on that. What I will say though is that even if there's not a genetic connection between two people groups separated by time, that doesn't mean that they can't be their heritage, right? That there can't be cultural continuity between them. And I think we've got to be very careful and sensitive to cultures around the world that, just because somebody, or when someone, is saying that their heritage goes back to X, Y, or Z, that doesn't mean, and this is just me sort of speaking extemporaneously here. I haven't thought this through in any depth. Actually, Megan would be a great person to ask this, my wife, who's also an Assyriologist. But I don't think that just because there's not a definitive genetic connection doesn't mean that they can't be part of that ethnic group. And certainly they can, right? There are lots of people that don't have genetic connections that are part of an ethnic group because ethnicity isn't directly connected to genetics. So I think we got to be really careful when we consider that it's not all about genetics.
Yeah. Yeah, true. I think you'd be interested. I think you'd be interested to know this. I actually talked to another person on Omegle who informed me that that genetics actually do matter, and the Bible is actually written about only white people, and it's a book for white people, and the Jews have controlled everything and corrupted everything in the world. So also the Earth's flat. So just so you can clear that up.
Sorry, I'm trying to get this down. So
Earth's flat. The Bible is about white people. For white people. Yeah. I don't know what white is in regards to genetics, but
thank you.
It was amazing. We're doing a video tomorrow, actually, a review of that video, because it was
good.
With epistemology, I have to kind of sit there and go, okay, all right,
interesting.
So if someone could explain to you that the Bible wasn't about white people, it was amazing.
Wow.
The people you meet on
America.
America, yeah, exactly. So I'm going to throw some names at you, and I was wondering if you could give me a history, like how historical they are. And I was hoping if you can give me like a percentage. So I don't know if 0% is they're completely mythological. 100% is they're 100% historical, and 50% is maybe they're legendary, somewhere in the middle. Some things about them is true. Okay, King David.
Yeah. Is the question, just so that I'm clear, if I say 100%, does that mean what's in the biblical text and who he was in history match up? And if I say 50%, it's he was a real guy, and probably a lot of these stories are close, but they've been spun heavily. Yeah. Okay. And David's, I'd say 50% then, and I can explain that. Joel Baden wrote a book on the historical David, and there's a lot of spin, a whole hell of a lot of spin going on in 1st and 2nd Samuel. You'll see David, who it's weird. He'll start off and he approaches there's a story about Nabal, who is this awful guy who is really, really rich and has a beautiful wife. And at the beginning of the story, he sends these, 10 young men to go tell Nabal, hey, you know what? All your shepherds that have been out in the fields, we've been protecting them. I mean, sure, you didn't ask us to, but we've been no harm has come to them while they've been under our protection. Please give us food and money and, sustain us, so that I could take a gift back to my master David. And when he very stingily says, no, I won't, suddenly, Nabal is dead. And David is married to his wife, and he's got all his shit. What? But the text is very clear David was nowhere near that scene. He didn't have anything. It was God that did it.
I love the way that you phrase these things too. That's so good. Because you've got this like academic scholarship, and then you say like David took all his shit. You know, it's so good. So Moses.
Yeah,
Uh-oh.
maybe 10%. I mean, like, was there a guy named Moses? Maybe. I mean, but
oh, here we go. That's the next amount of your next Twitter.
Yeah, it's all. Hey, you know what? I've got a chapter on the historicity of the Exodus in volume 2, and I'm going to do probably a bunch of interviews about the book and talk about it. So I'm sure that I will be catching tons of heat. Again, remember everybody, I'm giving consensus positions on these things. They're not. This isn't like my novel idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when that comes around, I'd love to interview you just on the Exodus, because that's a huge topic. Abraham.
Yeah. I mean, was 1%. Like, was there a guy named Abraham? Maybe. But I mean, like, none of the stories reflect, reality.
Okay. Wow. That's very interesting to me. And that's obviously going to be some news for 3 major religions or more. How historical is the Exodus? And we can obviously go into this in another date, but if you had to give a percentage, or
it depends on what you mean, as it always does, right? Was there an event or a number of events where you had Canaanites who were enslaved in Egypt that made their way out of Egypt over hundreds of years, several different examples of that? Sure. Yeah. I'd say probably 100%. In fact, almost certainly 100%. Are there 3 million people walking out of Egypt, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and then coming into Canaan and conquering it? 0, right? Like, no, not that.
Okay.
Not that.
Okay. All right. Well, that was interesting. So the next question is one that that is from Jacob, the Discord user again. I don't know. He said that you might not want to answer this question. So if that's the case, we can cut it out. I don't understand the nuances of it, obviously. But he said it might be a bit too political. Is the claimed Kurdish nativity of the upper Mesopotamian / Anatolian mountains true, or is the Kurdish history much more nomadic?
I don't have any information on it, unfortunately.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Just so we know too, just so you know, this Jacob, he's like a teenager. Like he's so switched on and so willing to have conversations. He's a Christian and he's so willing to have conversations with atheists and other people, just trying to work things. I really like him. He's a really cool dude.
I mean, everybody should know that I am hyper cautious about saying, about being clear that I don't know something and not speaking to it if I don't know it. So yeah, I'm because I think that maybe in the position that I'm in here online, I just don't want to. I don't want to get out of my lane.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
What I mean. So
yeah, where I get out of my lane all the time, and I love it. I think if I got a bit more academic, I'd have to stay in my lane. But it's fun to chat with people about stuff. Why do you think the Babylonians are portrayed more antagonistic than the Assyrians?
Yeah, I mean, I think. It depends on what part of the biblical text you're talking about, because the Assyrians are also depicted pretty terribly. So if you think about the timeline, and again, Pentateuchal studies is like not my area of specialization. There are people that dedicate their entire careers to it. So trying to determine things like when did the Deuteronomistic history or historian write? Like, when did those books come together? It's a whole subfield. But the times that the biblical books are coming together are during the Neo-Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian period, and maybe, certainly into the Persian period, I would think, to some degree. So you'll see, particularly the Assyrians and the Babylonians being portrayed in a very negative light. And of course, the Babylonians are the ones that take take Judah into captivity, right? So, in 586, the temple is destroyed and they're taken into captivity down till like 539. So of course, the people that are putting the biblical text together, editing the biblical text together, are from the south, and they're the ones that are being taken captive into Babylon, or into Babylonian captivity. And so, I think naturally a lot of the animosity is going to be directed toward their captors. So,
okay. I got two more questions. Do you think the 12 tribes were actually lost because of their enslavement by the Assyrians, or can it possibly be linked to certain Jewish communities within their written down locations of enslavement?
Again, this is sort of a sub section of research in the field. I think that probably, just from my very limited research into this, so take everything that I say right now with a grain of salt. I think that the 12 tribe, idea is probably not as solid as we might want to think. But again, that's probably more than I'd want to say about it, because you have two significant catastrophic events that take place in northern Israel, one in northern Israel, one in southern, and in 722. Samaria is destroyed and the north is taken, and then in 586, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, and Judah, the south is taken captive. So, what happens to the distinct tribes? I'm not sure.
Okay, I actually lied. We have two more questions, but they're fun questions. So a common talking point among believers is that we needed the laws to know what good or evil were. So, for example, as just an aside in the question, for example, I had someone tell me on Twitter that I wouldn't know that rape was wrong unless God told me that rape was wrong. And so my question is, do we have, and this is my question, do we have moral laws before the events of the Old Testament? And if so, how do apologists get around this?
I'm interested to know maybe the definition of moral laws.
So, like instructions on how to live, maybe?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, if we're talking about things like don't rape, I mean, you've got that back into the third millennium. What to do if somebody rapes somebody. The problem that I would say in response to that is, well, then you don't know slavery is wrong.
Wow.
Because you don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like,
is there anywhere in the Old or New Testament? I know New Testament isn't your expertise, but is there anywhere that that condemns slavery?
No. And so in the Atheist Handbook, I wanted to have a chapter for, the sake of completion. I wanted to have a chapter on slavery in one of the 3 volumes, but I didn't want it to be just a repetition, a shortened repetition of the book. So I added a couple of things to it. I did a bunch of research, and I wrote a section on the New Testament and early Christianity. And then I wrote one on, or a section of the chapter on the laws of the Antebellum South and how they compare. So there's actually a lot more in that chapter that is not in the book. But one of the things that I deal with are these arguments from like these major passages in the New Testament, because most apologists will say, well, sure, the Old Testament doesn't condemn slavery. And what they do to get around that is they appeal to like Matthew 19, right, where Jesus is saying, well, you have heard it said that you can write a bill of divorcement for your wife, but in the beginning it wasn't so, and Moses gave you this law because of the hardness of the heart. And they just extrapolate that and say, well, that must apply to slavery as well. And it's like, does it though? Is this thing on? So they'll also go to passages like Galatians 3:28, right? Neither male nor female, a Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And they'll say, look, see, there's neither slave nor free in Christ. Therefore, it's all equal, right? Well, that's not what that verse is saying. They'll go to 1 Timothy 1:10, where it talks about, people that are participating in the slave trade are, equal to like murderers. But that's not the flex that they think it is, right? They appeal to the book of Philemon. Philemon, it's asking Philemon to set Onesimus the slave free. Well, again, it's not the flex you think it is. So I deal with those things. So no, I mean, Jesus in Luke 17, tells his disciples, which one of you having a slave serving in the field all day, when he comes in at dinner time, would say to him, here, sit and eat? No, of course you wouldn't say that. You'd say, get in the kitchen and, make me dinner, and then get dressed and serve me and wait on me while I eat. And then only after that can you eat, right? It's an accepted part of the system, and it's one that Jesus certainly isn't condemning. He's assuming that the disciples would do it as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's the response for me anyway.
The Bible seems to make a lot more sense when you don't believe that it come from God. If you just see it as like people's ideas trying to work out the universe, it makes a lot of sense.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Last question. And thank you so much for, I know we've been chatting for a long time. I thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. The last question is regarding your lack of belief in God. What would convince you of the existence of the Christian God now? Like, what evidence would you need to see?
I've thought about that. And I'm afraid that my answer is going to be a disappointing one, because I'm not entirely sure. What I would like to think is that if right now Jesus materialized in front of me, and being God would know what would convince me that he actually is Jesus, then that would be. I suspect that would be sufficient. Or if I were, if I died and got to heaven and he's standing there going, "Sucks to be you, buddy boy," right? I would think
you
that
believe
would
in
be,
God in that,
yeah. I would think I would believe at that moment. But yeah, because I've thought, well, what if that happened? Well, then I might think to myself, well, God, this could be some sort of, maybe I'm incredibly tired and I'm hallucinating, or, but I don't think that would necessarily like hinder me from believing. Maybe if I'm hypercritical, I would say, well, maybe I can't know for certain that was the case, but I think it would have to be something appealing to my senses much more directly.
Cool. Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Deep Drinks podcast, Dr. Josh. Everyone needs to go and grab this book. It's not focusing very well.
No,
the Old Testament Endorse Slavery. Fantastic read. It's super.
Thank you.
The audiobook's really good as well. But I would also encourage people to check out your other book, Volume 1 of The Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. I just also want to say, I want to say thank you to you, because when my channel was under 100 subscribers, like I was nothing. I mean, I don't have any subscribers at the moment, but you helped me out in the video. Like I said, hey, I need you to check this for me. It was in the New Testament as well, so it wasn't even your expertise. I reached out to you on Twitter, and you watched it and you helped me, and you made me confident in releasing it. It took me like 3 months to work on. So I want to say thank you. And then later I saw your Megan or Megan. It's
Megan.
Megan. Okay. I saw her post on Twitter something about you, and I was like, this man will always be in my good graces. He helped me for even though, you know, he's an academic powerhouse, and he helped little old me with my thing. So I do seriously appreciate it. And thank you.
I don't think anybody's ever referred to me as an academic powerhouse. That was very generous.
An academic. I had to cut out a lot of your like stuff at the intro. Like I had to just mention your PhD, but there is a whole other bunch of stuff, and you can check it out in the Amazon.
Oh my gosh.
Review page. But thanks for coming on the Deep Drinks podcast, and thank you for introducing me to just delicious bourbon. I'm normally a Scotchman, but this is awesome. And thanks heaps.